When the coffin of my only son was lowered into the cold ground, I collapsed. I thought nothing could hurt more than losing my child. But I was wrong. The real pain came after the funeral, delivered by the woman who used to call me mother, my daughter-in-law, beautiful, charming, and venomous. She planned to take away everything I had left. I never imagined my own family could hide such terrible secrets. Stay with me until the end of this video and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from so I won't feel alone. And don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this video, my dear viewers. It was raining lightly that morning, the kind of steady Ohio drizzle that seeps into your bones. The cemetery ground was slick with mud, and a thin fog drifted between the gravestones like ghosts that had lost their way. I stood there, 70 years old this winter, wrapped in a black wool coat that no longer kept me warm. My fingers trembled around a small bouquet of white lilies, Stephen's favorite. The church bell tolled in the distance, solemn and slow, blending with the hiss of the rain. It sounded like grief itself. They lowered his coffin while people whispered prayers. My heart clenched as the rope slid, as if every inch pulled him farther from me. Stephen, my boy who used to call every Sunday, who said he'd come for dinner last month but never did. The silence he left behind was unbearable. I wanted to scream, but the sound wouldn't come. Only the rain spoke for me, falling harder now, washing the dirt from my shoes and the mascara from my lashes. Lorraine stood a few feet away, immaculate as always. Her black dress hugged her waist perfectly, and not a single strand of her golden hair was out of place. She kept her head bowed just enough to seem fragile, her lips trembling at the right moments, though her eyes were dry. People patted her shoulder, whispering words of pity. I watched her, wondering if anyone else noticed how easily she played the role of the grieving widow. My sister squeezed my arm, but I didn't move. I couldn't. My gaze was fixed on Lorraine. When she looked up for a second, our eyes met, hers calm, calculating, cold. A strange chill spread through me, colder than the rain. Something inside whispered that Stephen's death had not ended my suffering. Perhaps it was only the beginning. As the coffin touched the earth, I murmured under my breath, almost a prayer, almost a confession. My son, I've lost everything. But even as I said it, I felt that wasn't entirely true. Somewhere in the shadows, in that woman's eyes, there was something unfinished, something that would soon demand the strength I thought I no longer had. The guests had barely left when the house fell into that heavy silence that only follows funerals. The scent of lilies still hung in the living room, and the carpet was damp from wet shoes. I was about to make tea when Lorraine walked in without knocking. Her black coat dripped rain onto the floor as she slipped it off, revealing a designer dress that didn't quite fit the mood of mourning. She didn't even glance at Stephen's picture on the mantel. Instead, she looked straight at me with that same rehearsed sadness she had worn all day. "Stephen's gone now," she began softly, placing her purse on the sofa as if she owned the place. "It's just me and little Mia left. And the house. It's been so hard keeping up with the mortgage. I was hoping maybe you could let me borrow your name for a small bank loan." Her tone was honeyed, smooth, almost sympathetic. I blinked, unsure I'd heard her right. Borrow my name? For a loan? My hands tightened around the teacup. She continued, her voice still sweet but her eyes sharp. "You know, if you truly loved your son, you'd want to help his wife and child. Stephen would have wanted that." There it was. The shift. The softness fading, the demand underneath. It wasn't a request anymore. It was an order wrapped in guilt. I set the cup down slowly. My heart thudded hard in my chest, not just from grief but from the echo of that one phrase, the mortgage. Something didn't add up. 2 years ago, I had quietly paid off that very loan to secure Stephen and Mia's future, a secret gift I never told Lorraine about. I had the receipt locked away in my drawer, proof that the debt no longer existed. So why was she talking about a loan now? I looked at her carefully. Her hands were too calm, her eyes too clear for a grieving widow. My instincts, dulled by sorrow, began to sharpen again. "I see," I said finally, keeping my voice even. "Let's talk about it tomorrow, Lorraine. It's been a long day." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Of course, Diane, I knew you'd understand." She turned to leave, her perfume lingering after her like a warning. As the door closed, I sat alone on the couch, the clock ticking steadily beside me. My fingers trembled slightly as I reached for the drawer key. Something told me this was only the beginning. That night, after Lorraine left, I sat by the window and watched the rain smear the glass. The sound of it carried me back to a day I had tried hard to forget. Stephen had come over unannounced, his eyes red, his voice shaking. He had always been the strong one, my steady boy, but that afternoon he broke down on my shoulder like a child again. "Mom, I can't take the pressure anymore," he said, his words trembling. "The business is drowning. Lorraine keeps spending, the mortgage, the loans, everything's falling apart." I remember holding him tight, whispering that it would be all right, even when my own heart knew it wouldn't be unless I did something drastic. The next morning, I went to the bank. I withdrew every dollar I had saved over 40 years of teaching, $145,000. My hands shook as I signed the papers, but I told the loan officer, a kind man named Mr. Reynolds, that the payment must go directly under Stephen's name. He nodded, respectful and discreet. "Only you and I will know, Mrs. Parker," he said softly. And that was how it stayed. No one else, certainly not Lorraine, ever learned the truth. I didn't want her to know how much I had sacrificed. I feared she would see the money not as a lifeline, but as a resource to exploit. I told Stephen it was a loan he didn't need to repay. He cried again, promised he'd take better care of himself, of Mia, of their home. I believed him. I wanted to believe him. For a while I thought I'd done the right thing. Until tonight, when Lorraine mentioned the mortgage, as if the debt still existed. Now, sitting alone in the quiet house, the memory burned through my grief like a spark in dry wood. If the house was already paid off, why would she need another loan? The answer chilled me. She was lying. And not by accident. There was intent behind every word, every tear she shed today. I looked toward Stephen's photo on the mantel. "You didn't die from pressure, did you, son?" I whispered. The question hung in the air, unanswered. Heavy as the rain outside. Lorraine came back the next morning, uninvited as always. She didn't bother with small talk this time. Her heels clicked sharply against the wooden floor, each step echoing through the quiet house. She went straight to the point. "I've thought about it, Diane. If you don't help me, you're basically abandoning your granddaughter. You'd be responsible if we lose the house." Her voice was steady, almost calm, but her eyes burned with something darker. I felt the sting behind her words, that careful mix of guilt and blame she always used when she wanted something. I didn't respond, only looked at her hands. Perfectly manicured, the same hands that had signed every expense Stephen used to worry about. She sighed dramatically and called out, "Mia, sweetheart, come here." The little girl came running from the hallway, clutching her stuffed rabbit. Lorraine scooped her up and without hesitation placed her right into my lap. "Look at her," she said, her voice trembling now, full of performance. "Do you want her living on the street? Is that what you want, Diane?" Mia looked up at me with innocent, confused eyes, not understanding any of it. I stroked her hair gently, feeling her small heartbeat against my chest. "Sweetheart," I whispered softly, "you'll always have a home with me." Then I looked straight at Lorraine. "She deserves love, Lorraine, but money isn't love." For a moment the room went silent. Even the ticking clock seemed to pause. Lorraine's smile vanished. Her jaw tightened, her eyes hardening into something venomous. "Fine," she said at last, standing up abruptly. "But don't blame me when everything falls apart." She snatched her purse and stormed out. The sound of the door slamming echoed down the hallway, sharp and final. I sat there for a long time, holding Mia close until she fell asleep in my arms. When I finally laid her down on the couch and pulled the blanket over her, my mind wouldn't stop turning. Stephen's death, the sudden pressure from the bank, Lorraine's desperate insistence, it all started to form a picture I didn't want to see. My breath came slow and shallow. For the first time since the funeral, grief gave way to suspicion. I stood by the window, watching Lorraine's car disappear down the road. The wind rustled through the maple trees, cold and warning. Maybe Stephen hadn't died from stress after all. Maybe, just maybe, someone had helped push him over the edge. The house was painfully still that night. Only the slow, rhythmic ticking of the old clock filled the air, each sound echoing against the kitchen walls like a reminder that time hadn't stopped for grief. I sat at the table, both hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long gone cold. The steam was gone, just like Stephen's laughter, just like the warmth that used to live in this house. The kitchen light flickered softly above me. I stared at the empty chair across the table, the one he used to sit in when he stopped by after work. I could almost hear his voice again, see that tired smile that never fooled me. He'd say he was fine, that things at the firm were just stressful lately. But I remembered how thin he'd become, how the shadows under his eyes deepened every week. I should have asked more questions. I should have looked harder. Lorraine's words from earlier still rang in my head, sharp and bitter. If you don't help, you're hurting your own granddaughter. How easily she twisted guilt into a weapon. For years I'd told myself to keep peace for Stephen's sake, to ignore the way she controlled every room she entered. But tonight, something inside me shifted. The grief began to mix with suspicion, a slow, cold understanding that perhaps Stephen's death wasn't as simple as the doctors had said. I stood up and walked to the drawer by the window. My hands hesitated only a second before pulling it open. Inside was a folder marked Mortgage, paid in full. I flipped through the papers, page by page. Everything was there: the bank stamp, the final receipt, the transfer confirmation signed 2 years ago. It was all clear. The house had been completely paid off. There was no remaining debt. Lorraine's story was a lie. My heart beat faster, not from anger, but from fear of what that lie meant. If she was willing to deceive me about this, what else had she hidden? What had Stephen been dealing with before that night in his office? The thought twisted in my chest until I could hardly breathe. Outside, the rain started again, soft at first, then steady. I looked through the window, the droplets streaking down like tears I couldn't shed anymore. In the glass, I saw my reflection, an old woman caught between love and doubt. I whispered into the dark, my voice trembling. "Stephen, are you trying to tell me something? That it isn't over yet?" After my husband passed, I settled into a quiet rhythm of life in a small house on the outskirts of Cleveland. The neighborhood was peaceful, lined with maple trees that turned gold every autumn. My days began with the smell of coffee and ended with the sound of the wind brushing against the porch. It was a simple life, but it was mine, and after years of storms, simplicity felt like peace. I spent most mornings at the community kitchen downtown, tying on an old apron that smelled faintly of thyme and garlic. The volunteers there became my second family: retired nurses, widows, and young students who came to give their time. Together we made soups and stews for the homeless. I taught them how to stretch a dollar without losing kindness: a handful of lentils, a bone, a few carrots, and love. That was my recipe for dignity. Some of the men who came for meals would say, "Mrs. Diane, you make the best soup in Cleveland." I'd laugh and reply, "That's only because you're hungry." But inside, I knew they meant more. Food to me was never just food. It was a way to remind people that even when life takes everything, warmth can still be found in a bowl of soup and a gentle word. The neighbors often called me Soup Lady Diane. They'd wave from across the fence, sometimes stopping by for a cup of coffee or to drop off fresh herbs from their gardens. I liked listening more than talking. You learn a lot that way, about people, about kindness, about the small battles everyone is quietly fighting. People saw me as calm, harmless, the kind of woman who wouldn't hurt a fly. And that was fine. They didn't need to know the other parts: the years I spent working double shifts after my husband's illness, the nights I studied legal documents just to keep our home, or the way I learned, slowly but surely, that respect must be earned and defended. I wasn't weak. I had simply learned how to choose my battles and when to keep my strength hidden until the right moment. When Stephen came to me that winter afternoon, he looked defeated. His tie was loose, his eyes hollow, and his voice carried the kind of exhaustion that no sleep could fix. "Mom," he said, sitting heavily at the kitchen table, "the house payments are killing us. Lorraine's job barely covers the bills. I'm drowning. I listened in silence, my heart tightening with every word. I had seen the signs for months, the unpaid notices, the tension in his voice each time we spoke. That night after he left, I sat awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, thinking of all the years I'd spent saving, penny by penny. The money was meant for my old age, but what good was it if my son lost everything before I ever needed it? The next morning, I called Mr. Reynolds, the family lawyer who had helped me manage my late husband's estate. We met at the bank, where the air smelled faintly of polished wood and paper ink. "Mrs. Parker," he said gently, "you understand this is nearly all of your savings?" I nodded. "I do. I'm not giving it away. I'm protecting it. And I want the property transferred to my name." The loan officer, a young man who barely looked old enough to shave, blinked at me in surprise. Mr. Reynolds explained on my behalf. "It's a legitimate move. She's paying off the mortgage in full. She simply wants to ensure the deed reflects her ownership." It took a few hours of signatures, bank seals, and quiet determination, but by sunset it was done. The debt was cleared. The house was now legally under my name. When Stephen came to pick me up, he hugged me tight, tears slipping down his cheeks. "Mom, I'll pay you back," he said. I smiled softly. "Just promise me you'll live wisely. That's all I need." He thought I was being overprotective. He didn't realize I was being careful. Lorraine never knew. She went on believing Stephen was still paying monthly installments, proud to tell her friends how responsible her husband was. I said nothing. Some truths, I learned, were best kept quiet until the time came. The deed, the title certificate, and every receipt were locked safely in my home office safe, a small black box tucked behind old photo albums. "Just precaution," I told myself whenever I checked it. Precaution, but perfectly legal. That was the last time I ever touched my savings. I thought I had done the right thing. I thought I had secured our family's peace. But fate, I would soon learn, has a cruel sense of timing. When Lorraine became pregnant with little Mia, I thought life was finally settling into calm waters. Stephen called me the night they found out, his voice trembling with excitement. "Mom, you're going to be a grandmother." I remember how my hands shook as I held the phone. After years of watching him struggle, that single sentence felt like light pouring into a room long closed to the sun. I spent the next few weeks preparing the nursery. It was a small room at the end of the hallway, once filled with Stephen's childhood books and toy cars. I repainted the walls in soft cream, adding a border of golden stars by hand. Above the crib, I hung a wooden sign that read, "Little Star." I wanted Mia to grow up knowing she was loved from the very beginning. When the baby came, I couldn't stay away. I stopped by often to help, cooking warm meals, folding tiny clothes, and rocking Mia to sleep while humming old lullabies. Lorraine, though polite at first, began to show her irritation. "You don't have to do everything, Diane," she would say, her smile tight. "I have my own system." Sometimes she sighed loudly when I rearranged the kitchen drawers or washed the bottles differently from her way. Stephen tried to smooth things over. "Mom, don't mind her," he said one evening while walking me to the car. "Lorraine's just particular about how she wants things done. You know how she is." I nodded, brushing his arm affectionately. "I know, dear. Every young woman wants to do things her own way." I wanted peace, not tension. I told myself love was enough to mend any gap. For a time, it seemed to work. Sunday dinners were warm again, filled with laughter and baby giggles. Lorraine would hand me Mia for a few minutes, just long enough for a photograph, before taking her back with a practiced smile. I didn't notice the distance forming then. I didn't see the calculation behind the courtesy, the way her compliments came with an edge. I believed in family. I believed in decency. I believed that kindness would protect me, the way it always had. But I was wrong. I didn't yet understand that goodness, when placed in the wrong company, can turn into weakness in someone else's game. After the funeral, the house felt emptier than ever. The scent of lilies still lingered, the air thick with silence. I was drained, hollowed out by grief, barely able to stand without clutching the armrest of Stephen's favorite chair. But Lorraine, she was composed, disturbingly so. Her eyes dry, her voice steady. Not once did she say his name with tenderness. Not once did she ask if I was all right. Instead, she sat across from me at the kitchen table, notebook in hand, pen clicking in her perfectly manicured fingers. "We need to talk about the mortgage," she said flatly. "And Stephen's life insurance. The investment account, too. There are procedures we should handle quickly." Her tone was clinical, detached, like she was discussing a business merger rather than the death of her husband. I listened in silence, my body still, my thoughts a blur. She kept talking, numbers, deadlines, signatures, each word slicing through the room. Not a single mention of love, of memory, of loss. Just money, always money. Something inside me stirred then, a faint whisper of warning. I'd spent my life believing the best in people, but that instinct, the one that tells you something is terribly wrong, was waking up. Lorraine wasn't grieving. She was planning. And whatever she was planning, it had nothing to do with honoring Stephen. When she finally left, I sat for a long time in the dim light, the ticking clock louder than ever. I tried to convince myself I was imagining things, that grief was making me paranoid. But deep down, I knew better. The air around her felt wrong, too cold, too calculating. Later that night, long after midnight, headlights flickered outside the old house, the one Stephen and Lorraine had shared. I wasn't there, but I could almost picture it. Lorraine, her face hard in the dim light, using the spare key she thought I didn't know about. She moved from room to room, opening drawers, yanking open cabinets, even prying at the small safe Stephen once kept near his desk. She was searching for something, and I knew exactly what it was. The property deed, the payment records, the proof that the house wasn't hers to claim, but she would find nothing. Every document, every receipt, every signature lay secure in my own home, locked in the small black safe behind a row of old photo albums. I had placed them there 2 years ago, never imagining how much that single act of caution would matter one day. Outside, the rain began to fall again, soft and steady. Somewhere in the dark, I imagined Stephen's voice, faint but clear. "Be careful, Mom." I sat in the living room long after the rain had stopped, the air still carrying that damp, cold scent that follows a storm. Stephen's photograph sat on the mantel, the soft light from the lamp reflecting in his eyes. For hours I had stared at it, waiting for the pain to quiet, for the house to feel like home again. But grief had changed its shape. It was no longer a wound, it was a warning. Something in my gut told me that my son's death was not the end of sorrow, but the beginning of deceit. I rose slowly, knees aching, and walked toward his picture. "If you're not here to protect that home anymore," I whispered, voice steady, "then I will do it for you." My reflection blurred against the glass frame, but my eyes were clear. For the first time since the funeral, there was no trembling in my hands, only purpose. I went to the study, opened the small safe hidden behind the bookshelf, and pulled out the property documents. The papers were still crisp, the ink unblemished, the deed, the payment records, every signature neatly aligned. Proof that the house, the very roof over their heads, was secure under my name. I laid them out on the table like ingredients in a recipe, reviewing each one carefully. Old habits never die. Years in the kitchen had taught me precision, a clean counter, a sharp knife, a steady hand. I applied the same care now. I slipped every document into a new envelope, pressed the flap down, and sealed it tight. On the front, I wrote one word: protection. Then I placed it in the drawer of my desk, where only I knew the hidden lock. The woman staring back at me from the darkened window no longer looked broken. The wrinkles were the same, the gray hair the same, but there was something new in her face: resolve. I had spent a lifetime serving others, believing that kindness alone could keep a family together. But kindness without vigilance was a luxury I could no longer afford. From that moment, I was not the grieving mother people pitied. I was a woman preparing for battle, not one of shouting or vengeance, but of quiet, calculated defense. My weapons would be knowledge, truth, and the law. Lorraine might have thought she was playing a clever game, but she had underestimated the one thing she couldn't see. I was no longer afraid. The morning after the funeral was gray and silent. A heavy fog lingered over the porch, and the damp chill seeped into the air. I had just sat down with a cup of coffee when I heard a soft, deliberate knock at the door. When I opened it, Lorraine stood there holding little Mia in her arms. She was dressed in black again, her eyes red but dry, her hair slightly undone as if she had rushed through grief itself to get here. "Mom," she began, her voice trembling with practiced fragility, "I'm suffering. Stephen left me with a mountain of debt. I can't handle it anymore." Her tears glistened, perfectly timed, never spilling. Mia started crying, rubbing her tired eyes, overwhelmed by the early morning cold. Lorraine immediately turned the moment into her advantage, her tone shifting into quiet accusation. "Look at her, Mom. She's suffering too, because of you." The words stung, but I stayed silent. I took the child from her arms gently. Mia's small body trembled as she pressed her face against my shoulder. "It's all right, sweetheart," I whispered softly, rocking her slowly until her sobs eased. Lorraine stood nearby, her expression halfway between grief and calculation, eyes flickering like someone measuring the room. The act was too polished, her timing too perfect. The trembling voice, the misty eyes, the early visit. It all felt rehearsed, like a performance for an audience of one. I had seen true desperation before, in the eyes of the homeless men who came to my kitchen for soup. Their pain was real, raw. Lorraine's sorrow was crafted. She wasn't here for comfort. She was here with a plan. "Come inside," I said calmly, masking my unease. Lorraine stepped in quickly, glancing around the house with subtle curiosity. She took a seat without being asked, setting her designer purse on the table and folding her hands neatly on her lap. "I don't want to trouble you," she began again, "but I don't know what to do. The bank keeps calling, the insurance is delayed, and the bills just keep coming." Her sigh was long, deliberate, almost theatrical. I said nothing. I just sat there holding Mia as her breathing slowed and evened out. My heart softened for the child, but my eyes never left her mother. Lorraine's sadness was too controlled, her helplessness too strategic. When our eyes met, I saw something cold beneath the tears, intent, not sorrow. And in that moment, my grief began to shift. Something deeper stirred inside me, quiet but sharp. Suspicion. This wasn't a plea for help. It was the opening move in a game I hadn't agreed to play, but I would learn quickly how to win. Lorraine sat down on the edge of the chair, her hands trembling just enough to look fragile. She dabbed her eyes with a tissue, sighing heavily before speaking. "Mom," she began softly, her voice cracking in all the right places, "I just need your help with one small thing. If you could let me put the house under a temporary mortgage in your name, I'll take care of all the payments. I promise, it's just paperwork, really." Her tone was smooth, rehearsed, a perfect mixture of desperation and flattery. I set my teacup down slowly. The clink of porcelain against wood was the only sound between us. "The house?" I asked quietly. "You mean the one that's already in my name?" For the briefest second, her expression faltered. A flicker of surprise flashed through her eyes before she recovered, forcing a weak smile. "Oh, I didn't mean anything complicated, Mom," she said quickly, waving her hand as if brushing away a misunderstanding. "I just thought it would make things easier for me, to help the business. Stephen would have wanted that. He always wanted me to keep moving forward. Stephen." Hearing his name in her mouth felt wrong, cold. She used it like a shield, like a tool to soften me. But her words landed hollow. My son had worked himself to exhaustion trying to build that home, trying to give Mia a safe place to grow up. He had never once mentioned letting Lorraine handle the finances. In fact, he'd once told me, quietly, almost apologetically, that she wasn't good with money. I looked at her carefully. The expensive perfume, the perfectly manicured nails, the faint scent of impatience under her supposed grief, all of it painted a different picture. She wasn't struggling. She was scheming. She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Please, Mom," she whispered, her hand reaching across the table. I wouldn't ask if it wasn't important. You're the only one I can trust. I met her eyes, calm and steady. Trust, I repeated, almost to myself. The word lingered in the air, heavy and sharp. Inside, my heart ached for Stephen, for the son who had trusted the wrong person, for the little girl sleeping in the other room, caught in the middle of a web she didn't weave. I gave Lorraine a faint smile, polite, unreadable, and said, "I'll think about it." But in that moment, I already knew. Her plea wasn't a cry for help. It was bait, and I was no longer the naive woman she thought I was. I stood in the living room, my hands folded calmly in front of me, as Lorraine's voice rose higher with every breath. I had expected this reaction the moment I refused her request, but I didn't flinch. "Lorraine," I said evenly, my tone firm but quiet, "this house is Stephen's legacy. No one, absolutely no one, will use his name or mine to put it under mortgage again." For a split second she stared at me, speechless. Then her face twisted, red with fury. "Legacy?" she spat. "You mean your money, don't you? You've always been stingy, Diane. Even now, with your own son gone, you still count every penny." Her voice pierced the air like shattered glass. She grabbed the teacup from the table and hurled it to the floor. The porcelain exploded into tiny fragments, tea splashing across the carpet. "You're cruel!" she screamed, stepping closer. "Selfish old witch! You've spent your whole life clinging to money and now you'll die alone, just like you deserve." The words hit hard, but I didn't react. I had learned long ago that silence could be stronger than anger. I simply looked at her, my expression calm, my eyes steady. Her rage seemed to feed on itself. She was no longer performing for pity. This was the real Lorraine, vicious, entitled, unmasked. Behind her, little Mia began to cry from the noise, her small voice trembling in confusion. Lorraine turned for a second, barking at the child, "Stop crying!" before whipping back toward me with venom still dripping from her tongue. I took a slow breath and straightened my back. "I think you should leave," I said, almost whispering. The serenity in my tone only enraged her more. She stormed toward the door, muttering curses under her breath, the sound of her heels striking the floor sharp and angry. When the door slammed shut behind her, the house fell into silence again, broken only by the soft sniffles of my granddaughter in the hallway. I exhaled slowly and walked to the corner cabinet, pressing a small button hidden under the edge of the shelf. The red light blinked faintly, confirming what I already knew. The security cameras had recorded everything: her screams, her insults, her violence. I had installed the system years ago, not out of paranoia but out of necessity. Age teaches caution, and I had learned to protect myself not just with kindness, but with proof. As I gathered the shattered pieces of porcelain from the floor, I caught my reflection in the window. My face looked tired, but my eyes were steady. The performance was over. The truth had begun. Lorraine stormed out of the house, dragging little Mia by the wrist. The child stumbled, trying to keep up, crying softly as her mother's voice tore through the morning air. "You'll regret this, Diane!" Lorraine screamed, her face twisted with rage. The screen door slammed so hard that the sound echoed down the quiet street. Across the road, Mrs. Thompson, my elderly neighbor, had stepped onto her porch, still in her housecoat. She froze for a moment, staring, then shook her head in disbelief. Later, I would hear her mutter to another neighbor, "What kind of daughter-in-law screams at her mother-in-law like that, especially after a funeral?" The silence that followed felt heavier than the shouting. I remained in my chair, the air thick with the smell of spilled tea and broken porcelain. My hands trembled slightly as I reached for Stephen's photograph, the one I kept on the side table. His smile stared back at me, gentle and steady, just like always. I placed the frame in front of me and whispered, "Your house is safe, my boy. Don't you worry." But the words cracked in my throat. My tears finally came, not from fear, but from sorrow, because now the truth began to settle in. That fury, that venom Lorraine had thrown at me, it couldn't have appeared overnight. It was too practiced, too full of resentment. My heart tightened as a dreadful thought took shape. Stephen, I whispered again, my voice barely a breath. Did you hear words like those every day? Did you carry that cruelty alone while I thought you were just tired? The question hung in the room like smoke. The clock ticked. The curtains swayed faintly in the breeze. I stared at the shards of the broken cup scattered across the floor, the remnants of a storm that had been brewing far longer than I'd known. Each piece glittered under the weak morning light, sharp and cold. I closed my eyes for a moment, the ache in my chest deepening. Pity, grief, guilt, they tangled together until they became something else entirely. A quiet, cold determination, the kind that didn't cry or shout, but planned. I had lost my son once to blindness, blindness to what was happening right in front of him. I wouldn't make the same mistake again. When I opened my eyes, the tears were gone. What replaced them was stillness, the kind that precedes action. Lorraine thought she had won this morning, walking away in her fury. She didn't realize that she had just given me something stronger than fear. Clarity. That night, sleep never came. The house was silent except for the faint ticking of the clock and the hum of the refrigerator. I sat at my desk, the soft glow of the lamp casting long shadows across the room. On the table lay a folder I hadn't touched in months. Stephen's old legal documents, neatly labeled in his handwriting. My fingers hesitated before opening it, as if doing so might summon memories too painful to bear. Inside were contracts, emails, and bank statements. I flipped through them slowly, each page a piece of my son's life I was only beginning to understand. Then one email caught my eye, a message Stephen had sent 6 months before he died. Lorraine insists on handling the investment herself. I'm not sure it's wise. My breath caught. Investment? He had never mentioned that to me. Lorraine had always brushed off questions about their finances, saying, "It's complicated, Mom." I turned to the laptop on the corner of the desk and logged into the old email account I had helped Stephen set up years ago. My hands trembled slightly as I searched through his sent messages and attachments. There it was again. References to a real estate project managed entirely under Lorraine's name, with money transferred from Stephen's personal savings. My heart sank. I opened the bank records next, and as I traced the numbers, something icy crept up my spine. Multiple withdrawals, large ones made over the last 3 months of his life, thousands of dollars disappearing without clear purpose. The realization came like a cold wave. This wasn't carelessness. This wasn't grief spending. It was deliberate, planned. There was no other explanation. I sat back, my pulse racing, the pages trembling slightly in my hands. For years I had thought Lorraine's greed was small and selfish, the kind that ruins families quietly. But this was something darker. The precision of it, the timing, the secrecy, it all pointed to intent. My stomach turned as the memory of Stephen's final weeks replayed in my mind. His fatigue, his tension, the way he avoided certain topics. He had been hiding something, or perhaps protecting me from it. I turned toward his photograph on the mantel, the soft candlelight flickering against his smile. "My boy," I whispered, my voice low but steady. "If I'm going to find the truth, I'll have to dig deeper than ever before. And this time, I won't be fooled again." The wind outside picked up, brushing against the window like a whisper of warning or encouragement. I straightened the stack of papers, sealed them back into the folder, and felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Focus. Grief had clouded me for too long. Now clarity had returned. The game had changed, and I was no longer just a grieving mother. I was an investigator. 2 days later, the phone rang just as the morning light spilled through the kitchen window. The voice on the other end was gentle, hesitant. "Mrs. Parker? This is Daniel from the office where Stephen used to work. We were clearing out his desk this week and found a box of his personal belongings. There are a few items you might want to keep." His tone softened. "He was a good man, ma'am. Everyone was shocked that night. He stayed late to finish the quarterly report." For a moment I couldn't speak. My throat tightened, and the familiar ache crept up behind my ribs. "Thank you," I finally managed to whisper. "Please, send it to my home." That afternoon, the delivery arrived. The box was smaller than I expected, neatly taped, the company's logo faintly stamped on the side. I carried it to the kitchen table and sat down, staring at it as if it might speak first. My hands trembled as I cut through the tape. Inside were fragments of a life: a laptop, a few notebooks, a chipped coffee mug with the words #1 Dad engraved in fading blue, and one item that stood out: a small black leather journal. The air around me changed as I lifted it. The faint scent of peppermint lingered. Stephen's scent. He used to chew peppermint gum when he worked late, saying it helped him stay awake. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the smell take me back. I could almost see him again, sitting at his desk, tapping his pen, smiling at the thought of coming home to tuck Mia into bed. The memory hit like a wave, warm and cruel at the same time. I touched the journal's cover. The leather was worn smooth along the edges, the elastic band slightly frayed. It looked like something he had used often, not an ornament for show, but a companion for thoughts he never shared aloud. I turned it over in my hands, my heart pounding harder with each second. Part of me wanted to put it back in the box, seal it shut, and never open it. But another part, the part that had begun to question everything, whispered that this could be the key. Stephen had always been careful, deliberate. If he had kept a journal, it meant something. I looked at the photo of him on the wall above the mantel, his smile frozen in time. "What were you trying to tell me, Stephen?" I murmured, tracing the spine of the book with my fingers. The peppermint scent lingered, soft and haunting, like his presence in the room. I set the journal down gently beside the mug. For the first time since his death, I felt not just grief, but anticipation. Something in that box was waiting to speak, and I was finally ready to listen. The black leather journal felt heavier than it looked. Diane ran her thumb across the small metal clasp, noticing the faint scratches where Stephen's nails must have fumbled during long nights of writing. It was locked with a simple 3-word code, and for a moment she almost laughed through her tears. She knew what it had to be. Apple Pie 93. It had always been his password for everything, from his email to the garage door, because on his 8th birthday, back in 1993, she had baked him his favorite apple pie, the first dessert she'd made after his father passed. He used to say it was the taste of home. Her fingers trembled slightly as she typed in the letters on the tiny combination lock. A soft click broke the silence. The clasp gave way. She hesitated, taking a deep breath before opening it. The first page was neat, the ink faded a little at the edges. On top, in Stephen's handwriting, were the words, "If you're reading this, it means I no longer had the courage to speak." Her chest tightened. She could almost hear his voice, the calm, thoughtful tone he always had when trying to hide worry. She began to read. "Lorraine has changed," the next line said. "At first I thought it was the stress, the late nights, the arguments. But now when I look into her eyes, I see someone else, someone I don't know. Sometimes I think there's another man." Diane's breath caught. Her hands pressed tighter around the edges of the book. The pages were filled with short, restless sentences, written in hurried pen strokes, as if he had been afraid someone might walk in. Some words were smudged, the ink blurred where tears, or sweat, had fallen. "She hides her phone," another entry read. "She says it's for work, but the messages aren't professional. I checked once. There were hearts, names I didn't recognize. I wanted to ask her, but every time I try, she turns it around, says I don't trust her. Maybe she's right. Maybe I'm losing my mind." Diane swallowed hard, her throat burning. She could almost see him sitting at his desk, writing these words late at night, the light of his computer reflecting in weary eyes. The loneliness seeped through every line. The final entry ended mid-sentence. "Sometimes I wonder if—" Then the pen had stopped, leaving only a faint pressure mark on the paper. Diane traced it with her fingertip, as if touching the moment he had faltered. Tears welled up, but not from grief this time, from clarity. Her son had been crying for help, and no one had heard him. She closed the journal gently, pressing it to her chest. "I'm listening now, Stephen," she whispered, "and I'll finish what you couldn't." The next pages of my son's journal grew darker. The handwriting turned rougher, The ink pressed so hard into the paper that each word looked carved out of pain. I turned the page carefully, my breath shallow. And then, Stephen's words began to unravel a truth I was not prepared to face. Her meetings run late again, he wrote. Always with the same man, Mark. She says it's business, but I know that name. He was her ex, the one she swore she'd never see again. My stomach clenched. Mark. The name itself felt poisonous. Still, I kept reading. I checked her phone tonight, the entry continued. Messages, dozens of them. I miss you. You make me feel alive again. Pictures. She didn't even bother deleting them. When I asked her, she laughed. She said, "You're too weak, Stephen. I need a real man." The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. I could almost hear Stephen's voice, calm even in despair, asking questions he already knew the answers to. Lorraine's cruelty dripped from every line. Then came the sentence that made my heart stop. I did something tonight I never thought I would. I took Mia's toothbrush and sent it to a lab. My hands trembled as I read the next few lines. The results came back. No match. I read the paper 5 times. It still said the same thing. Mia isn't mine. I wanted to burn it, to pretend it didn't exist. But I can't. She's innocent. She calls me daddy. I can't take that away from her. I pressed the journal to my chest, shaking. The room around me seemed to fade until all I could feel was Stephen's pain filling the air. I could picture him sitting alone in his office late at night, staring at that piece of paper, holding a truth that had broken him from the inside out. The final paragraph on that page was brief, as if he no longer had the strength to write. I don't know who I am anymore. I go to work so I don't have to go home. Every night I tell myself tomorrow will be better, but it never is. When I closed the book, my hands were ice cold. The peppermint scent that once brought comfort now felt haunting, almost cruel. I looked toward Stephen's photograph on the mantel, his smile kind, trusting, unaware of the betrayal that would one day destroy him. A single tear slid down my cheek. But it wasn't just grief anymore. It was fury, quiet and deep. Lorraine hadn't only broken my son's heart, she had taken everything that gave his life meaning. I wiped my tears and whispered into the still air, "You deserved the truth, my son, and I swear to you, she will not bury it again." The deeper I read, the more the pages seemed to bleed. Stephen's handwriting, once neat and careful, had grown uneven. Pressed so hard into the paper it looked as though every word had been carved out of fear. My eyes traced the next entry, and the words made my stomach twist. Lorraine asked me to sign a financial authorization form today, he wrote. She said it would make the investment easier to manage. She smiled when she said it, but her eyes were somewhere else. I didn't want to sign, but she insisted. She said I was making things difficult, that I was holding her back. My hands trembled as I turned the page. The ink was darker here, the lines more frantic. I think she and Mark are using my accounts. The numbers don't add up. There are transfers I can't explain. When I ask, she changes the subject or gets angry. She says I'm paranoid. Maybe I am. Or maybe I've already lost control of everything without realizing it. The room grew quiet. Only the ticking of the clock filled the air. My throat tightened as I kept reading, even though part of me didn't want to see what came next. The last paragraph was short, just one final sentence. "If something ever happens to me, please tell Mom I'm sorry for staying silent." I froze. The words blurred, the pages trembled in my hands. For a long moment I couldn't move. The world seemed to shrink until there was only me, the desk and the journal that now felt like a tombstone resting on my lap. My tears fell onto the paper, smudging the ink, blurring the final confession of a son who had died alone. Stephen hadn't just been taken by illness. He had been broken by betrayal, suffocated by manipulation, silenced by fear. The clock kept ticking, cruelly steady, as if nothing had changed. But something inside me had. My grief, once raw and consuming, began to harden into something sharper. The trembling in my hands stopped. I straightened my back, lifted my chin, and looked toward Stephen's photograph across the room. "Silent no more," I whispered. My voice was quiet, but my heart was roaring. The sorrow that had chained me for weeks burned into purpose. I would not let Lorraine bury my son's truth, not in lies, not in money, not in silence. As I closed the journal, its final page still damp with tears, a strange calm settled over me. The woman who had been broken by loss was gone. In her place stood someone new, someone who would fight, not for revenge, but for justice. The evening light poured softly through the window, painting my living room in shades of gold and shadow. I sat still, my hands folded on my lap, eyes fixed on the framed photograph of Stephen resting on the mantel. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't crying. The tears had dried, leaving behind something colder, sharper, a quiet focus. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, but inside there was only the steady rhythm of my own heartbeat and the faint ticking of the clock. I leaned back slightly, my gaze distant yet deliberate, like someone studying the board before making a decisive move. The grief that once paralyzed me had turned into calculation. I wasn't a broken mother anymore. I was a strategist. I reached for my phone on the table, my fingers steady now. Scrolling through my contacts, I found the name, Mr. Reynolds, the lawyer who had once helped me transfer the house into my own name. He was a man who knew both the law and my quiet strength. The line rang twice before a deep voice answered. "Mrs. Parker?" "I need to see you," I said, my tone even but urgent. "As soon as possible." There was a brief pause. "Is everything all right?" I looked once more at Stephen's smiling face in the photograph. "Not yet," I replied softly, "but it will be." After ending the call, I turned back to the desk. The black journal lay open beside the lamp, its pages worn and fragile but burning with truth. I lifted my phone and began taking pictures, page by page, ensuring every word, every line, every tear stain was preserved. My movements were slow and methodical, like a craftsman handling evidence rather than memories. When I was done, I placed the original journal inside my small home safe, the same one that held the deed to my house and my late husband's old watch. It wasn't sentiment, it was instinct. Years of managing a home, protecting a family, and learning how easily trust could be broken had taught me one thing: always keep proof. The light outside dimmed, the last streaks of orange fading into dusk. I closed the safe, straightened up, and looked out the window. The reflection of my face in the glass looked unfamiliar. Calm, yes, but colder, more determined. "My son," I whispered toward the photograph across the room. "If you couldn't protect yourself, then I'll do it for you, through the only power no one can deny." My fingers brushed against the safe's metal surface, cool and solid beneath my touch. Justice wasn't a fantasy anymore. It was a plan. And that night, I took my first step. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. The house was quiet, still heavy with the weight of everything I had learned. I dressed in a gray wool coat, tucked Stephen's black journal and a folder of financial documents into my bag, and drove toward a small office on the edge of town. The name on the frosted glass door read, "Greg Holloway, Private Investigations." Greg had once been a police detective, a man I trusted more than most. Years ago, he had helped me recover some stolen property after a neighborhood break-in. Now his hair was grayer, but his eyes were still sharp, the kind of eyes that missed nothing. He greeted me with quiet respect. "Mrs. Parker," he said, pulling out a chair. "It's been a while. What brings you back to me?" I placed the journal and the documents on his desk. "I need to know where my son's money went," I said steadily, "and who took it." Greg opened the folder and began to study the records. He frowned. "These transfers, they're not small, and they're regular. Look here." He turned his screen toward me. Every 2 weeks, funds were moved from Stephen's account to something called M&L Holdings LLC. I leaned forward. "M&L, Mark and Lorraine." Greg nodded. "Exactly. I did a quick search before you arrived. That company's in trouble. They're being sued for accounting fraud and illegal investment practices. The case hasn't gone to court yet, but it's public record." I sat back, my pulse steady but my eyes cold. So they used Stephen's account to funnel money into their company, and when it started collapsing, she tried to mortgage my house to cover it. Greg looked up from the papers. It fits. And there's more. The last transfer happened 3 days before Stephen's death. The words hung in the air like smoke. My fingers tightened around the teacup he'd offered me. 3 days, I murmured. He must have known. Greg gave a slow nod. I'll dig deeper. Get you everything. Bank records, communications, even witness statements if needed. But you should be prepared. This could get ugly. I met his gaze, my voice calm and unwavering. I've lived through ugly, Mr. Holloway. What I can't live with is silence. As I left his office, the cold morning air brushed against my face. I looked toward the horizon, pale sunlight breaking through the fog, and whispered to myself, so that's what she wanted, to use my home to hide her debts. For the first time, I didn't feel powerless. The truth was no longer buried. And the woman who once wept at her son's grave was now standing at the threshold of battle. For the next 2 weeks, Greg worked quietly but relentlessly. Every morning he left his office before sunrise, camera in hand, and every night he returned with more evidence. He tracked Lorraine's movements across Cleveland and its outskirts, following her subtle trail of deceit. Through a long lens, he photographed her meeting Mark at a small cafe near the highway, the kind of place people choose when they don't want to be seen. In each photo, their gestures told a story: hushed conversations, the exchange of thick folders, hurried glances over their shoulders. Sometimes they left separately, only to meet again hours later at a hotel on the west side of town. Greg's reports came in daily, each one painting a clearer picture of what I had suspected all along. This wasn't desperation, it was strategy. One evening, Greg called me with a voice that mixed exhaustion and triumph. "Mrs. Parker," he said, "you'll want to hear this." He played back an audio recording captured from a small device he'd planted near their usual meeting spot. Lorraine's voice was unmistakable, sharp, impatient. "If she signs, we get the collateral," she said. "The bank approves the loan and we're in the clear. If she doesn't, I'll use the old house deed and make a copy. She won't know until it's too late." There was a pause, followed by Mark's low, careless laugh. "You really think you can pull that off?" "Please," she scoffed. "I've handled worse." I listened in silence, my knuckles white as I gripped the armrest. Greg's voice came through again, calm but grim. "There's more. I got photos of the documents. They're using forged papers, signatures copied from earlier records. I verified one with a contact at the courthouse. It's fake, Mrs. Parker, every line of it." He handed me a folder the next day. Inside were color photographs of the fraudulent documents, Lorraine's handwriting scrawled in the margins, and printed bank memos linking her and Mark to the same shell company. I took a long breath, staring at the stack of proof, not just of greed, but of cruelty. This wasn't simply about money anymore. It was about control, manipulation, and the exploitation of an elderly widow's trust. "These," Greg said, tapping the folder, "are more than enough to build a case. Fraud, forgery, elder psychological abuse. Under Ohio law, that's serious time." I nodded slowly, my voice calm but steely. "Then let's begin." That night, I laid the documents neatly on my dining table, beside Stephen's photograph. His gentle smile seemed to watch over me as I whispered, "You didn't die for nothing, my son. They took everything from you. But this time, I'll take it back." I walked into Mr. Reynolds' office carrying the weight of a week of discoveries, an evidence folder tucked under my arm like a lifeline. The room smelled faintly of old paper and lemon polish, and the walls were lined with heavy binders of estates and trust agreements, the same kind he had helped me manage years ago. When he looked up from his desk, his face softened into a quiet expression of concern. I set the documents down in front of him, my hand steady despite the storm beneath my ribs. I told him everything I had learned, page by page, the transfers, the secret meetings, the forged signatures, the audio recording Greg had captured. He went through each photograph and bank statement slowly, tracing the numbers with his finger as if following a map that might lead us both to justice. When he finally leaned back, the silence stretched for a long moment before he spoke in that calm, deliberate legal tone I had come to trust. "Mrs. Parker," he said, "what you've brought me isn't just proof of greed. The pattern of transfers and forged documents point to fraudulent misrepresentation and elder financial abuse. Under Ohio law, those are serious offenses. He explained that with a certified financial expert's report linking the transfers to M&L Holdings and with notarized copies of the forged documents, the county prosecutor would have sufficient grounds to open an indictment. I listened without interrupting, my heart steady, though my fingers clenched around the folder like a vow. Then came the plan. Methodical, precise. He advised that I secure the originals in a safe deposit box and prepare certified copies for court. We would begin with a civil complaint to freeze Lorraine and Mark's assets, then file a criminal referral based on the forgeries and the exploitation of an elderly person. He outlined the need for a forensic accountant who could trace layered transactions through shell companies, and he promised to contact a trusted CPA with expertise in such matters. As he spoke, I felt something shift inside me, a strange blend of relief and resolve. Relief, because I finally understood that the law, when handled correctly, could be both shield and weapon. Resolve, because mourning had turned into motion. Before I left, Mr. Reynolds looked at me quietly and asked what I truly wanted in the end. His question lingered, heavy but necessary. I told him I didn't want revenge. I wanted truth, truth brought into daylight, truth that could not be buried under legal tricks or polite sympathy. He nodded once, firmly, and said he would begin drafting the initial filings that very night. As I stepped outside, the late afternoon sun poured across the courthouse steps, warm but solemn. I paused for a moment, feeling the full gravity of the days ahead. I had once been a woman who baked pies, volunteered at soup kitchens, and believed that gentleness could keep a family together. But that day, I learned that gentleness must walk hand in hand with proof, and with the steady machinery of the law. I was ready to let that machinery move, to have truth spoken aloud in a courtroom, and to watch the fragile scaffolding of their lies crumble. One oath at a time. The sky over Cleveland was a pale washed gray when I parked outside the small DNA testing clinic, and I stepped out of the car with a weight in my chest that felt heavier than the folder at my side. Inside, everything was bright and antiseptic, the kind of clean that pretends to remove history. I handed the technician a tiny plastic bag with a few fine, golden brown hairs, taken from Mia's brush, the same brush I had kept tucked away since the day my son died. My hands were steady. My heart was not. They said the test would take 48 hours. 2 days stretched ahead like a long, thin road, long enough for old memories to return, long enough for a stubborn hope to fight and fall. I drove back home through a city moving in slow motion, each stoplight keeping time with the pulse in my throat. When the clinic called, I went alone. The receptionist gave me a sealed envelope with a softness that felt almost like pity. I sat in my car beneath a sky that had begun to cry, and for a time I simply held the envelope, unwilling to let the paper decide the shape of the rest of my life. Then the rain tapped in a steady rhythm against the windshield, and I tore it open. The words stared up at me in black letters. Probability of biological relationship, 0%. My fingers crumpled the page as if the paper were the thing that had lied to me. I did not weep. The tears I had shed in the weeks before had become something colder, an exacting sorrow that sharpened into resolve. The child's connection to my son was gone in the wording of a test, but what remained, uncorrupted and clear, was compassion. I saw Mia's smile again, simple, trusting, unknowing. She was not the architect of these betrayals. She was their innocent center. Stephen's own voice, soft, exhausted, came back to me out of the pages of his journal. I love her, even knowing she isn't mine. My lips moved without sound. So will I whispered. But I will not forgive the woman who destroyed him. Those days that followed were deliberate. I spread evidence across my dining table under the lamp's steady light. Bank statements, photographs, copies of forged documents, audio files, and the hair test result that sealed a truth I had feared. I made 3 identical sets, one for Mr. Reynolds, one for the bank's legal department, and one for my private safe, a safe with its own little camera that streamed to the cloud. Every sheet was scanned, every margin checked. One misplaced paper could mean the difference between vindication and defeat. I asked my neighbor, Mrs. Linda Meyer, to give a statement. She had seen the argument the day of the funeral and did not hesitate. Her sworn words became another brick in the case I was building. By Saturday evening, my kitchen no longer felt like a place of mourning but of order. A teapot steamed beside the folder labeled Final Submission. I stood for a long time looking at Stephen's photograph, his smile gentle and forever 38, and I told him aloud, "You were once the reason I stayed gentle. Now you are the reason I must be strong." At 9 o'clock, I called Mr. Reynolds. "It's time," I said simply. "Monday morning we begin. I want everything brought into the light of the law." He answered, steady and sure. "Understood. We'll make it count." Outside, the street was quiet, deceptively peaceful. Inside me, a different weather had settled. Not acceptance, but clarity. My kindness would no longer be a shield for their lies. It would be the mechanism by which truth was made visible, and justice finally allowed to take its due. Monday morning arrived bright and cold, the kind of day when downtown Cleveland hummed with the rhythm of business. Inside the glass-fronted main branch of Lakeside National Bank, the air smelled faintly of coffee and printer ink. Lorraine sat at the manager's desk, her pen poised delicately between manicured fingers, her perfume mingling with the sterile scent of the office. She looked every inch the professional woman. Navy suit, pearl earrings, that polished smile she used whenever she needed to look trustworthy. Across from her sat Mark, tie loosened just enough to seem relaxed but professional. To the banker, he introduced himself as Mark Davis, financial consultant. His voice was smooth, his handshake practiced, his lies effortless. Together, they looked like the perfect clients, ambitious, articulate, confident. Lorraine leaned forward with her most convincing tone. "We're finalizing a loan for $310,000, she said, sliding a folder toward the bank officer. "It'll be secured by a property at 1289 Maple Avenue. The title is under my mother-in-law's name, but she's agreed to co-sign. Everything's in order." The banker nodded and began flipping through the papers. Deeds, signatures, notarized statements. Everything looked official enough. Lorraine's pulse quickened with satisfaction. She shot Mark a discreet glance. He gave her a small approving smile. It was almost too easy. And then the glass doors at the far end of the lobby slid open. Two figures entered, me and Mr. Reynolds. I walked slowly but with purpose, my gray wool coat falling neatly against my sides, black gloves clasped together. My silver hair was pulled back, my face calm, almost serene, but my eyes found her instantly. Lorraine froze mid-signature. The color drained from her face. "What? What are you doing here?" she stammered, voice cracking through the quiet lobby. I didn't answer right away. My heels clicked softly on the marble floor as I approached. When I spoke, my voice was quiet but carried through every corner of the room. "I came," I said evenly, "to see what's being sold. And by whom?" Lorraine forced a trembling laugh. "You must be mistaken, Mother. This is just—" "Really?" I interrupted, my gaze never leaving hers. "Because I'm here to watch someone try to sell what they never owned." The banker's head lifted sharply. Mark's confident posture stiffened. Lorraine's pen slipped from her hand and rolled across the desk. The room went still. Mr. Reynolds placed a thick folder on the table with a deliberate thud. "This," he said calmly, sliding the first page toward the director, "is the original title deed. It lists Mrs. Diane Parker as the sole legal owner of the property since 2021. Every payment, every record, verified by this very bank." The director's brows furrowed as he read. Lorraine's breath came shallow. "That can't be," she whispered. I I have copies." "Yes," Reynolds replied smoothly. "Forged ones." He inserted a flash drive into the computer. A video appeared. Lorraine in my living room, screaming insults, throwing a teacup, calling me a greedy old woman who should have died with her husband. Gasps filled the room. The banker froze, his face hardening. "Mrs. Bennet," he said coldly, "forging documents and using an elderly person's property as collateral is elder financial and emotional abuse under Ohio law. Lorraine's voice cracked. No, it wasn't me. She told me to. I said nothing. I didn't have to. The truth was speaking for me. Reynolds continued, steady as stone. Mrs. Parker never authorized a thing. Her verified digital signature is on file. Yours, however, was copied, and poorly. The director leaned back, his decision final. We're calling the police. All transactions under this account are frozen. Lorraine turned toward Mark for help, but he had already stepped back, silent, his eyes down. And in that moment, the truth stood exposed, raw, undeniable, and complete. There was nowhere left for their lies to hide. I rose from my chair slowly, each movement carrying the weight of years, years of patience, silence, and endurance. My spine was straight, my chin lifted. Morning light from the tall windows caught the silver in my hair, and for a moment even I could feel the strange calm of transformation, not weakness, but command. When I spoke, my voice was quiet, low, but it carried through the room like distant thunder. I never authorized anyone to sign in my name, I said evenly, my eyes locked on Lorraine. You forged those documents. You insulted the woman who raised your husband, and now you think you can take the roof over his mother's head? The words landed like hammer blows. Lorraine's painted composure cracked, her voice rose to a sharp, panicked pitch. You set me up, she screamed. You recorded me, manipulated everything. You wanted to ruin me. I didn't flinch. No, I said, my tone turning to steel. You ruined yourself with greed, deceit, and arrogance. The room went utterly still. Even the soft hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to vanish. Everyone felt it. The line had been crossed and the game was over. Security, the branch director said, his voice firm. Call the police. At the far end of the table, Mark took an uncertain step backward. His confidence drained away, sweat glinting on his brow. I turned toward him, my voice calm but edged with truth. And you, Mr. Davis, how much did she promise you? Or was betrayal its own reward? He had no answer. His eyes fell to the floor. Lorraine glared at me, trembling. You think this makes you noble? You think you've won? I met her gaze steadily. Winning was never my goal, I said softly. Justice was. Two officers entered through the glass doors. Their radios crackled, and the room fell silent. One of them unfolded a document and spoke with calm authority. Mrs. Lorraine Adams, he said, you are under arrest for property fraud and forgery of mortgage documents. You have the right to remain silent. Lorraine's chair screeched backward as she stood, panic in her voice. No, please, I have a child. You can't do this to me. The child is innocent, I said quietly, but the mother isn't. Her fury broke into sobs. You think he'd be proud of you, your precious Stephen? My voice was steady. No, I said, but I think he'd finally be at peace. As the officers led her away, her cries faded down the corridor. Another officer stopped Mark before he could slip out. Mr. Mark Davis, you'll need to come with us. M&L Holdings is under federal investigation for fraud and money laundering. The cuffs clicked shut again. When silence finally settled, I didn't smile or gloat. Justice, I knew, wasn't triumph. It was balance. Mr. Reynolds rested a hand on my shoulder. It's over, he murmured. No, I said gently. It's just beginning. The rebuilding. Later, in the bank director's office, the tension lingered like the echo of thunder. The director apologized sincerely. Reynolds opened his briefcase and placed one final envelope on the table, the DNA test results. These confirm that the child, Mia Adams, is not biologically related to the late Mr. Stephen Parker, he explained. Given the mother's arrest, we're requesting temporary guardianship for Mrs. Parker until a court appoints a permanent custodian. I looked out the window at the clearing sky. I didn't give birth to her, I said softly, but my son loved her as his own, and I will continue that love, as he would have wanted. Even the director seemed moved. Reynolds nodded. The paperwork will be ready by tomorrow. When I left, sunlight poured through the glass, golden and clear. For the first time in years, I felt light. Not because revenge was complete, but because truth had spoken. Justice didn't scream. It simply stood. When the truth finally arrived, 3 days after the arrest, the city of Cleveland awoke to headlines that made the morning air crackle with shock and outrage. On the front page of the Cleveland Herald, bold black letters cut through the fold. Bank employee arrested for fraud and elder abuse. Below the headline was a photo that needed no caption. Lorraine, once immaculately dressed and self-assured, being led out of the bank in handcuffs. Her hair was disheveled, her expensive blazer wrinkled, and her eyes wide with disbelief. The flash of cameras turned the moment into something merciless and permanent. Reporters crowded around the patrol car, their microphones thrust forward like weapons. "Miss Adams, did you really forge your mother-in-law's signature? Do you have a statement about the charges? Is it true that M&L Holdings filed for bankruptcy this morning?" Lorraine didn't answer. Her lips quivered, her face pale as the officers guided her into the back seat of the police car. The door slammed shut with a metallic thud, final, cold, inescapable. The story, however, had already escaped into the world. By noon, every local news station replayed the footage on loop. Anchors spoke in grave tones about a case that revealed the hidden epidemic of elder financial abuse, showing clips of a 67-year-old widow who had uncovered a web of deceit stretching from her own family to a corporate fraud scheme. Social media lit up like wildfire. Under the headlines, thousands of comments poured in. "Can you imagine betraying your husband's mother like that? She deserves every charge. This Diane woman, what a powerhouse. Calm, classy, and unstoppable." Talk shows discussed it as a cautionary tale, how elder exploitation often hides behind smiling faces and family dinners. Local attorneys even praised the legal precision of my actions, noting how I had gathered evidence, involved the proper authorities, and let the law speak instead of vengeance. The Herald followed up the next morning with a feature titled, "Elder Justice Served: How a Retired Widow Outsmarted a Conspiracy." The article carried a photo of me leaving the courthouse, wearing my gray coat and black gloves. I wasn't smiling, but I wasn't broken either. The reporter wrote that I had become a symbol of quiet strength for women who refused to be silenced. I gave no interviews, no statements. I didn't need to. The truth had already spoken, louder than I ever could. Meanwhile, Lorraine's downfall was swift and merciless. Her name was everywhere, her reputation disintegrating overnight. The woman who once strutted through charity galas and high-end boutiques now stood as a cautionary headline, the embodiment of greed, deception, and ruin. And while the city gossiped, I stayed home. The garden behind my porch was blooming again, marigolds, lilacs, and small daisies swaying in the autumn breeze. I tended to them quietly, pruning with steady hands. I didn't need applause or pity or revenge. Justice had already spoken, clearly, firmly, and for all to hear. Mark's fall came swiftly, almost as if the world had been waiting for it. 2 days after Lorraine's arrest, he tried to disappear. At dawn, he walked into Cleveland Hopkins Airport dressed in jeans and a windbreaker, carrying nothing but a small black suitcase and a one-way ticket to Florida. He thought he could outsmart everyone one last time. But he was wrong. Federal agents had been watching him for days, tracing every transaction linked to M&L Holdings. As he reached the security checkpoint, a firm hand landed on his shoulder. "Mark Davis," the agent said, "you're under federal arrest for financial fraud and money laundering." For a moment, Mark froze. Then came the flash of cameras, the sharp metallic click of handcuffs, and the collective murmur of witnesses who recognized his face from the news. The man who had built his world on charm, deceit, and counterfeit confidence now stood exposed, stripped of everything but fear. By noon, the story was everywhere. The Cleveland Herald ran the headline, "Businessman linked to Ohio bank fraud arrested at airport." The details unraveled quickly. Reporters revealed that M&L Holdings had been laundering money through multiple shell accounts, disguised as investment operations. Funds meant for clients had paid for luxury trips, jewelry, and vehicles. Federal investigators confirmed that every dollar spent was traceable, every signature forged. The company's accounts were frozen, and civil suits flooded in, investors demanding justice, banks demanding repayment. The total claims exceeded $600,000. And because both Mark Davis and Lorraine Adams had signed as managing partners, the debt was personal. Everything they owned, properties, vehicles, jewelry, even furniture, was subject to seizure. The empire they had built on greed and arrogance was crumbling piece by piece. Lorraine's luxurious downtown apartment was the first casualty. Court officers sealed the door with red tape marked "Property under investigation." Her sleek white Mercedes was towed from the parking garage that same afternoon. Boxes of jewelry, designer handbags, and electronics were catalogued as evidence. Neighbors gathered in the hallway, whispering behind their hands. "She always acted so perfect," one said. "Guess we finally know what was hiding behind all that perfume and pearls." Within days, the scandal scorched through Ohio's financial world. Emails circulated across banks and institutions. Lorraine's name was added to the industry's permanent blacklist, banned from any position involving trust or finance. Her career, once polished and proud, was effectively over. Meanwhile, in a cold federal holding cell, Mark sat alone, staring at the concrete wall. The phone in the corner remained silent. The woman he had manipulated was gone. The money he had stolen had vanished into frozen accounts. And the charm that once opened every door now meant nothing. There was no plea deal that could undo what had been done, no clever excuse that could rewrite the truth. Their downfall was complete, not with shouting or spectacle, but with the quiet inevitability of justice catching up. The humiliation didn't come from the courtroom or the headlines. It came from the people Lorraine once believed would stand by her. Within days of the scandal breaking, reporters tracked down her mother, Mrs. Hilda Adams, a stern, church-going woman who lived quietly in a small Indiana town. They found her on her white-painted porch, sweeping leaves into a neat pile. When the cameras approached, she didn't hide behind the door or ask for privacy. She looked straight into the lens. "I no longer recognize that woman as my daughter," she said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. "She chose greed over decency. She dug her own grave with her lies." The statement hit the front page of every major Ohio and Indiana newspaper the next morning. It wasn't just an interview. It was a public disownment, a mother's final verdict. And for a woman like Lorraine, who had built her entire life on reputation and admiration, it was the cruelest cut of all. Relatives who once bragged about her success stopped answering her calls. Cousins deleted old family photos that included her. The friends who used to meet her for brunch at the downtown cafe quietly removed her from group chats, their messages reduced to a polite silence. By the end of the week, Lorraine had been erased, not by law but by collective shame. Even in the professional circles she had once dominated, rejection came fast and cold. Former colleagues released statements denouncing her actions, not out of moral duty, but to protect themselves from scandal. The woman who once exuded poise and confidence had become a corporate warning label, a reminder that greed could devour even the most polished image. But the harshest blow came from her own community. At St. Agnes Church in Cleveland, where the Adams family had once attended Easter Mass, the Women's Fellowship organized a meeting titled "The Sin of Greed." Flyers were pinned to bulletin boards and handed out after Sunday service. During the gathering, the pastor spoke about how pride and money could corrode the human spirit. He never said her name, but everyone knew who he meant. "Let us learn," the pastor said solemnly, "from those who traded family for fortune and respect for deceit." The congregation nodded in silence. Some prayed. One elderly woman raised the morning paper, Lorraine's mugshot printed clearly on the front, and shook her head, not in anger, but in sorrow. In her holding cell, Lorraine watched the broadcast replay on the small television mounted above the bunk. The audio was faint, but her mother's voice carried clearly, cutting through the hum of the fluorescent lights. "She dug her own grave with her lies." When the screen went dark, the echo of those words stayed. For the first time, Lorraine didn't feel anger or defiance, only emptiness. The world she had built from vanity and manipulation had turned away. Family, friends, faith, all gone. And in that stillness, surrounded by gray walls and silence, she realized the truth she had spent her life avoiding. The only thing left to lose was herself. After weeks of hearings, testimonies, and cross-examinations, the courtroom finally fell silent. The air inside the Cuyahoga County Courthouse felt dense, as though it carried the weight of every truth that had surfaced and every lie that had collapsed beneath it. Lorraine sat at the defendant's table, shoulders bent, eyes hollow. The proud poise she once wore like armor had vanished. Across the aisle, I sat beside Mr. Reynolds, calm and steady in my navy blue coat, hands folded neatly in my lap. When the judge entered, the entire room rose. The sharp crack of the gavel cut through the hush. "This court has reviewed all evidence presented," the judge declared, his voice firm but measured. "The defendant, Miss Lorraine Adams, is found guilty on 2 counts: elder financial fraud and falsification of legal documents." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Lorraine's attorney leaned in to whisper something, but she didn't respond. Her eyes stayed fixed on the floor, fingers twisting a strand of her hair until it snapped. The judge continued, the tone of finality in his voice unmistakable. "Given the defendant's lack of prior convictions and her cooperation after arrest, this court sentences her to 5 years of suspended imprisonment, 2 years of community service, and full restitution of all legal costs to Mrs. Diane Parker." A silence deeper than before filled the courtroom. Then the judge lifted another page, reading carefully. "Furthermore, the court reaffirms that the property located at 1427 Elmwood Drive is the sole and legal possession of Mrs. Diane Parker. Her ownership is absolute, uncontested, and protected under state law." The words fell like a closing door, not triumphant but final. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I simply breathed. A long, steady exhale that seemed to empty months of tension, grief, and endurance from my chest. It wasn't victory I felt, but release. Across the room, Lorraine lifted her head. Her mouth opened slightly, as if to speak, but no sound emerged. The courtroom officer approached, guiding her toward the exit. The sound of her heels echoed briefly against the marble floor before fading into silence. The judge stood. "Court adjourned." Another strike of the gavel, one clean note that seemed to mark the end of everything that had begun months before. I rose slowly. Mr. Reynolds gave me a small, respectful nod. Together we gathered the folders that had once been weapons in a quiet war. The evidence, the files, the proof that truth still had its place in the world. As we turned to leave, I caught sight of the stained glass window above the courtroom. Morning light poured through it, washing the floor in soft shades of gold and blue. For the first time in a long while, the silence didn't feel heavy. It felt peaceful. Justice, I thought, doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just breathes, steady, certain, and clear. When the legal battles were finally over and the headlines began to fade, I made a quiet decision that surprised everyone. I sold the house on Elmwood Drive, the very place where my pain had begun. It would have been easy to keep it as a monument to what I had endured, but I didn't want monuments. I wanted beginnings. A few months later, I stood inside the modest hall of a community center in downtown Cleveland. Behind me hung a simple white banner with blue letters, the Stephen Adams Foundation. It was a charity I had founded in my son's name, its mission clear and humble: to support children who had lost their fathers and women who, like me, had endured financial exploitation or abuse. The reporters who came expected celebration, a victory speech, perhaps something dramatic, but I spoke softly, my tone calm and steady. "My son didn't die because of weakness," I said. "He died because he carried too much. Too many expectations, too many secrets, and too little kindness from the people around him. I can't bring him back, but I can make sure others don't suffer the same silence." The room fell completely still. My words weren't rehearsed, but they came from a place deeper than grief, from understanding. In that silence, I could feel something shift. It wasn't pity that filled the room, but respect. The foundation grew faster than I ever imagined. Local volunteers came forward. Donations arrived from across Ohio. Within months, we were funding literacy programs for children and hosting workshops for older women on financial safety and self-advocacy. I spent my mornings visiting shelters, teaching simple home cooking classes to widows starting over, and my afternoons reading stories to children who reminded me of my grandson. I never mentioned Lorraine's name again. There was no need. Justice had done what it was meant to do. What remained now was healing. Quiet, slow, but far stronger than revenge could ever be. Neighbors who once whispered behind their curtains began stopping by with flowers or warm bread. They spoke my name with gentleness now. One elderly man told a local journalist, "That woman didn't seek revenge. She built something stronger. She built healing." Sometimes I would catch my reflection in the foundation's office window. Older, yes, but calm. My eyes no longer carried the weight of loss, only the clarity that comes after it. One Sunday morning, I returned to the small garden behind my cottage. The chrysanthemums were in full bloom, their yellow petals glowing under the autumn sun. I watered them slowly, the air cool and clean. For the first time in years, there was no heaviness in my chest, no ache in my hands, only peace, quiet, steady, earned. I smiled faintly and whispered to the sky, "Stephen, your story didn't end in pain. It ended in purpose." A few peaceful weeks later, I returned to the soup kitchen on Maple Street, the place where I had once learned that giving could heal more than taking ever could. The familiar scent of broth and freshly baked bread welcomed me like an old friend. I tied my apron, rolled up my sleeves, and began stirring the pot, the steam rising softly against my face. Above the counter on a wooden shelf sat Stephen's photo, my boy, forever smiling. I looked at it for a long while and whispered, "Justice doesn't need noise. Sometimes it's just truth finally stepping into the light." Around me, life went on as it always had. Volunteers chatted, spoons clinked against bowls, and laughter floated through the room. Yet inside me, everything had changed. I was no longer the woman who once trembled under grief and betrayal. I was simply at peace. Later that afternoon, Mia waited by the window, her crayons scattered, a little smudge of color on her cheek. "Grandma," she asked, "can we bake apple pie again?" I smiled. "Yes, sweetheart, we can." It didn't matter that she wasn't my blood. Love isn't built from blood. It's built from choice. Every time I looked at her, I saw the kindness Stephen had left behind, the proof that something good could still grow from what had been broken. As the sun dipped low, I stepped outside the kitchen. The city glowed in soft gold, and for the first time in years my heart felt light. The storm had passed, not because I had won, but because I had chosen to let go. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's this: silence helps no one. So if you've ever been betrayed, dismissed, or made to feel small, tell your story. Don't hide it out of fear or shame. Speak it, write it, share it. Because every word of truth you release becomes a light for another woman still lost in her own storm. Wisdom doesn't age, and dignity, it never dies.